Wow, that was a really dramatic introduction to what's going to be an otherwise boring video. Anyway, what do we know about St. Nicholas? And to what extent can we trust it? Very little about Nicholas of Patara can be known with absolute certainty because little has survived about Nicholas. I am fully confident that he was a real person because of the wealth of tradition around him. Much of the rest of what we know can be trusted with caution. While we have no absolute proof of anything, the records regarding St. Nicholas corroborate accurately. We do the same with biblical manuscripts. We compare a scroll of the book of Matthew to another by a different scribe, and the high degree of similarity gives us confidence. We can also have confidence because most of the records do not turn Nicholas into a glorified person who was beautiful and supernatural, but rather they're about a holy man who loved people. There were also no political reasons to make Nicholas into something he wasn't, and the main recorder of Nicholas' story was a man living in Constantinople who had nothing to gain financially from recording stories about his life. Nicholas was born somewhere between 260 and 280 AD in Patara, Lycia, in the region of Asia Minor. This is modern-day Turkey. His parents were middle-class traders. Throughout the Roman Empire, landowners were wealthy, and merchants and traders made up the middle class. The rest, which was the vast majority, were fairly poor, and there were no social services offered by the empire. All were left to fend for themselves or die. All records and legends state that Nicholas' family were Christians and raised him in the church. Nicholas' parents would have been very private about their faith. The Emperor Valerian was kind towards Christians until the end of his reign, where he started persecuting them and destroying church buildings. Many Christians during this time worshipped quietly and kept their ear to the grindstone, often speaking with mariners at docks, etc., to see what was happening elsewhere, and always being prepared to flee. It was in the midst of this that Nicholas grew up and prepared to be a priest. Multiple traditions cite that Nicholas' spiritual gifts were noted at an early age, and that he was encouraged to enter the priesthood. This is a sign that Nicholas was good with the Greek language, the language of the New Testament, good at philosophy, but also that he was not a greedy child despite his parents' wealth. Priests were ascetics, which are people who live with very little. There is no way they would have chosen a rich kid to mentor unless they knew he could survive on very little. The Christian church in that era was the institution that filled the gap of social injustice, caring for the poor, the lame, and the elderly, which explains its rapid growth in an empire filled with poverty. Nicholas' parents died early, but we don't know the cause. They left him a decent inheritance and land, which put him in a position to serve God and remain financially independent. There is no physical description of Nicholas anywhere, but we can assume he would have had dark hair and eyes, and probably wore a cotton tunic and sandals. He would have also barely been 5 feet tall. Nicholas is a Greek name, so he was likely a Gentile. All relic depictions of Nicholas picture him as an old man with dark skin and white hair, often holding biblical scrolls. Patara, the birthplace of Nicholas, was a town of about 15,000 before the Great Persecution. It was not a peasant town, it was a town of people that prided themselves on producing fine foods and fine crafts, primarily for local use and local consumption. Patara was a colorful town and was known for pottery, woodworking, metalworking, glass, bone and shell crafts, and some stone making. Locals ate lots of fish, grains, and olives, and produced lots of wine too. You might drink too if all you ever ate was fish and olives. Patara was wealthy enough to have a school, so Nicholas would have learned to read and write and do simple math in addition to learning his trade. Patara at that time would have been stuck in the tradition of Greek pantheism, and would have largely worshipped the goddess Artemis, who had a place of honor at the Acropolis, or the highest spot in the city. Patara had stone roads, bridges, and even aqueducts for public bathrooms and public bathing, which made for an interesting moral dilemma for Christians. The theater in Patara had 25 rows at 50 meters long each, which would have seated around 3,000 people. As a young man, Nicholas served as a priest in Patara. Very early in the 4th century, at about age 30, he became the bishop of Myra, which was the capital city of Lycia and a bigger city than Patara. This was a promotion of sorts. Becoming a priest was highly dangerous because the priest was the keeper of the holy texts. A typical priest would have 2 things. One was a letter called the Didache, which was an early Christian manual for life and worship that emphasized loving neighbors and charity and also purity. The other would have been any copies of Old Testament or New Testament scrolls they had, and very few priests would have had the entire Testament, or the entire Bible for that matter. During times of persecution, the letters were the very thing that the emperors wanted to destroy, which is why many priests were expert copyists. Nicholas and his church would have suffered through Diocletian's persecution. In 303 AD, Diocletian started a persecution of Christians that lasted 2 years because he became increasingly frustrated with their inability to worship the Roman pantheon. He also thought that Christians were depressing, because in the Roman world, the wealthy hung out in certain parts of town and could altogether avoid the poor, and not even think about them. But the Christians were well aware of their poverty and had compassion and strived to help. Diocletian also outlawed Christian meetings and sent armies throughout the empire to destroy Christian buildings and burn scriptures. Many Christians had employment via the empire, and all were forced to sacrifice to the gods or be fired. Later, Diocletian forced all priests to sacrifice to the gods or be imprisoned. Nicholas was imprisoned in 305 AD for less than a year, and he would have only received one small meal per day and water. He was likely forced into public regularly and told to forsake Christ and worship the Roman gods. Tradition holds that he would not do this and received many beatings. Late in 305, another Roman high-ranking official named Galerius, who was planning on being the next emperor, set fires to Diocletian's house to try to kill him, and blamed the Christians for doing it. Diocletian believed the lie and started martyring Christians. Early persecutions were also fueled by silly rumors. One was that Christians were atheists, because they did not believe in the gods. One was that they were cannibals, because they ate and drank the body and blood of Christ. Another was that they were incestuous, because they called each other brothers and sisters. These persecutions typically served to grow the church, as fence-sitters saw the courage of the Christian leaders, and masses converted. It was the great Tertullian who said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." All persecution ended in 313 when Constantine became the emperor, and he ushered in a new era of tolerance. Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which made all faiths tolerable and specifically made owners of property that belonged to Christians before the Great Persecution give the land back free of charge. Some Greek historians, including the trustworthy Eusebius, claim that Nicholas was present at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which was the source of the Nicene Creed. In summary, Nicholas loved God, and he took up the vocation of priest at an early age to help nourish souls and bodies in Myra. His parents died early, leaving him an inheritance, but he also worked hard to provide for the needs of himself and the others in the community, and thus was a giver of gifts and one who met needs. As bishop, he put himself at great risk during the Great Persecution and suffered captivity for a short time. After being released, he returned to Myra to rebuild the community there. Nicholas died at Myra and was buried there in the small basilica that bears his name to this day. Tradition holds that he died December 6 in 343 AD, and December 6 became St. Nicholas Day not long after. In the 11th century, Italian mariners transported St. Nicholas' remains to Bari, Italy. They went to Myra, where his remains were, in the basilica, and pretended to be there peacefully. Once the local Christians realized what they were doing, the mariners drew swords. The locals called their tactics into question, given their common bond in Christ. So one of the mariners took a hammer and started to smash the coffin, grabbed the remains, and ran off with it. The Myrians chased after them and swam out into the water, but to no avail. His remains remain in Bari, Italy, to this day. There are several stories about St. Nicholas that have survived. Some are about an interaction with him while he lived, and some are about his spirit after he died. The most famous work was by a scholar from Constantinople named Michael the Archimandrite. Michael's work is somewhat reliable because he had no political or other motives to write, just a love for the story of Nicholas. He wrote 6 short stories by interviewing people in Myra in the 8th century, some 500 years after Nicholas lived. The fact that the stories survived is a testament to Nicholas' popularity. However, over the course of time, stories get changed, and some elements might not be trustworthy. What likely is trustworthy is the overarching character of Nicholas. In each story, he is a compassionate man who cared about welfare and justice. The following are summaries of Michael's short tales. The first story is called Gift to 3 Daughters. Young Nicholas learns that a family is destitute, and the father plans to sell his daughters into bonded servitude, or in other words, prostitution. Nicholas secretly delivers money to the family in order to save them from ruin. The next story is called Protection of the Innocents. St. Nicholas learns that 3 innocent citizens are about to be executed. He hurries to rescue them and confronts the offending magistrate, who was only going to kill them for bribery money in the first place. The third story is called 3 Generals. 3 innocent generals have been unjustly accused of treason and are sentenced to execution. They pray to God for their rescue, invoking the spirit of Bishop Nicholas of Myra in their prayers. The innocent are released after the emperor and his praetorian prefect receive visits from Bishop Nicholas, who demands that justice prevail. The next story is called Rescue of the Mariners. Mariners at sea become grounded in a severe storm. They pray to God for their rescue, calling upon the spirit of Bishop Nicholas of Myra. The mariners free their ship from imminent destruction and sail to Myra to thank Bishop Nicholas, whom they credit with rescuing them. The fifth story is called Wonder of the Grain Ships in Port. A famine has taken hold in Lycia, threatening the whole province, including Myra, with starvation. Bishop Nicholas diverts grain from visiting ships by simply asking for help, and distributes it to save the people of Myra. The final story is called Wonder of Artemis. St. Nicholas warns pilgrims who are en route to visit his church in Myra to dispose of the evil balm they have unwittingly received from the goddess Artemis. And that's what we know about Nicholas. So, how in the world do we get from a dark-haired, olive-eating Christian social worker to the plump and jolly Santa Claus? Well, the story takes a turn or two, as you might imagine. From the 1st century to the 4th, Christians celebrated the Nativity of Jesus in the early part of December. By the start of the 4th century, Christians decorated their homes with greenery and lit many candles, and also gave simple presents and candies to friends and family, imitating the Magi, who gave gifts to Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. Jewish religious groups often followed this model. They commemorated important events with festivals that often lasted a week. During the 4th century, Christians started celebrating on December 25th, because that day was the most prominent pagan holiday, the birthday of the sun, and the god associated with the sun, Saturn. The Christian concept was to transform something pagan into something holy. This was the example of Christ. Shy of a few millennia later, the commemoration of St. Nicholas on December 6 merged with the celebration of the Nativity, which had taken the place of the Roman celebration of Saturn. While this happened slowly and over the course of many years, it is explainable. To start, the name Santa Claus comes to us by way of the Dutch Sinterklaas, which in turn was a form of St. Nicholas, the central figure of the feast of St. Nicholas, celebrated on December 6. When the Dutch established their colony of New Amsterdam in America in the 7th century, they brought with them the traditional visit from Sinterklaas, or St. Nicholas, on the eve of December 6, the night before the feast. When the English later took over the colony and renamed it New York, English children longed to have a Sinterklaas of their own that would bring them gifts. However, English Protestants did not observe saints' days for fear of idol worship, since Eastern believers often turned saints into idolic figures, and Nicholas was no exception. As a result, the Sinterklaas visit was moved to Christmas Eve, and observed then to avoid any association with the feast of St. Nicholas. Author Washington Irving, who lived from 1789 to 1853, was most famous for the legend of Sleepy Hollow, was an important figure for the information he gives us on the Dutch version of Sinterklaas in the early 19th century. Washington's 1809 work, titled The History of New York, also called the Knickerbocker History, was a satire on the transplanted customs of the Dutch of New York City. The history contains several references to the legend of St. Nicholas, as observed by the Dutch. The St. Nicholas described by Irving was an old man in dark robes who arrived on a flying horse on the eve of St. Nicholas Day to give gifts to children. In his Folklore on the American Land, author Duncan Emmerich tells us of the next evidence we have of the American evolution of Santa Claus. It's a little-known poem, The Children's Friend, first published in 1821. The poem went beyond what Irving had written, mentioning for the first time a flying sleigh and reindeer. The poem begins, "Old Santa Claus, with much delight, his reindeer drives this frosty night, o'er chimney tops and tracts of snow, to bring his yearly gifts to you." There is universal consensus that the person most responsible for shaping the American version of Santa Claus was Dr. Clement Clark Moore, a theology and classics professor at Union Seminary. What did Moore do to earn this honor? He wrote a simple poem for his own children in 1822, entitled A Visit from St. Nicholas, which begins with the now famous words, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in the hope that St. Nicholas soon would be there." There is a legend that Moore wrote this poem on Christmas Eve, 1822, during a carriage ride to his home in Greenwich Village, and that the inspiration for the St. Nicholas in his story was the Jolly Dutchman driving his carriage. In any case, in describing St. Nicholas, Moore went beyond anything that had ever been said before. It was Moore who increased the number of reindeer to 8 and gave us their names. It was he who explicitly described Santa going up and down the chimney, leaving toys in stockings hung by the fireplace. Moore's St. Nick was chubby and plump. He was a jolly old elf who carried a bundle of toys on his back. He had eyes that twinkled, dimples that were merry, cheeks like roses, a broad face, and a little round belly. It's interesting that Moore's Santa was also a small elf who flew in a miniature sleigh pulled by 8 tiny reindeer. The poem wasn't published until a year later. It was published secretly, without Moore's consent. He didn't think it was worthy of publishing. Many others did, however, and it turned into an overnight sensation. It was a Bavarian political cartoonist named Thomas Nast who gave us the picture of Santa Claus that is now so common. Nast's Santa Claus was plump and very human, not elfish. Nast, the father of political cartooning in America, drew more than 2,200 cartoons from 1862 through 1886. Many of these were of Santa Claus at Christmas time. Before Nast, St. Nicholas had been pictured as everything from a stern-looking bishop to a gnome-like figure in a frock. Nast was clearly inspired by Moore's 1823 poem, but he also added additional features to the Santa Claus story, such as Santa's home in the North Pole, his workshop filled with elves, and his list of good and bad children. Believe it or not, the Coca-Cola Company also contributed to the modern Santa Claus. Beginning in 1931 and for 35 years, Coke ran advertisements that featured a human-sized Santa drinking Coke. These ads contributed much to the modern image of Santa Claus, and also to the drinking of Coke. So there you have it. Jesus' birth is still an important part of Christmas in America. Nevertheless, the irony is that in the era of Constantine, Christians turned a pagan festival into the celebration of Christ's birth, only to have English Protestants accidentally turn it back into a non-religious celebration because they were trying to avoid idol worship. The sad reality is that Christians today could have 2 wonderful celebrations. We could celebrate the life of St. Nicholas on December 6 and commemorate a man of charity and justice. We could also celebrate the birth of Christ on December 25 and give gifts to imitate the Magi. Instead, Most people have no idea how we've gotten to the place where we are and spend the entire season riddled with stress and financial concern. So what are we to do? I think it is simple. The month of December is a time to commemorate and to be blessed by two stories of men who were rich, yet became poor for the sake of others.